Welcome to Stargazer, a podcast about astrology, alchemy, and magic, coming to you from the City of Angels in sunny Southern California. My name is Rachel, but you probably know me as Aeolian Heart, and I'll be your host. Hello, Stargazers. Welcome back to another episode. I'm so glad to have you here to listen to another strange, cosmic, trippy conversation between myself and Paul Weston. And I invited my husband, Andre, into this conversation as well, because it actually took all three of us to try and thread together the strange web of synchronicities that we are actually discussing. Let me explain. The reason I know Paul Weston in the first place, who came on the show a couple months ago to talk about his book, History and Myth, the reason I know him at all is because of an article that I wrote when Saturn moved into Capricorn back in December of 2017. And that article was inspired by the work of Robert Anton Wilson for a lot of reasons that I cannot go into right now. But I chose Robert Anton Wilson to be the sort of patron saint of Saturnian wisdom to guide me and my readers through the Saturn in Capricorn era, which has spanned from December 2017 until the present moment. And Paul Weston reached out to me at that time, and we began an online friendship. And I have been a really huge fan and a follower of his work ever since. So bring it back to the present moment. 2020 has been a very difficult and strange year. So my husband Andre and I decided that what we needed to do was teach our spiritual alchemy class, Spiritualized, so that people who wanted to learn how to transmute darkness into light, stagnation into creative movement, people who wanted to learn how to work with very difficult energies and make them into something beautiful, we wanted to offer that opportunity. And so we started an email series letting people know that we were going to offer this class again. And in order to get people into the vibe of our spiritual alchemy class, we thought it would be really awesome to start teaching them about synchronicity. And when you want to teach the concept of synchronicity, you have to go back to Carl Jung. Paul Weston reached out and said he couldn't believe that we had written that email because he was having a whole series of synchronicities that this particular story, that these particular synchronicities had been opening up in his life. And so he told us that we were going to have to talk and that we would share with one another all of the crazy things that had connected between our universes. And so that is what this conversation is. And it's a perfect time because bringing it back once more to Robert Anton Wilson, it just so happens to be Leo season, which is cosmic trigger time. For those of you familiar with Robert Anton Wilson's story, this was around the time that he claims he began to receive transmissions from the star Sirius. If you don't know that story, I highly recommend that you become familiar with it. I tell a really condensed version of it in Golden, a royal celebration of the sun in Leo, which is a free event that I held if you're interested. So during this season of high weirdness and strikingly strange cosmic vibrations, it was really nice to have Paul Weston open up a conversation with my husband and I, and we really hope that you enjoy what came through.
Right.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Stargazer. And I'm very pleased today to be inviting Paul Weston back to the show. This is the second episode we're doing with Paul. Hello, Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. In case you missed the last episode, Paul is one of my favorite independent scholars, and he has written 10 amazing books on all kinds of fascinating esoteric subjects. He came on Stargazer a few months ago to talk about his latest book, which is called History and Myth, which is a really original and really beautiful look at history through a cyclical as well as astrological lens. And naturally, I really connect with Paul's work because he has a really far out cosmic mythopoetic sensibility, and therefore I find his interests to be very congruent with my own. And it seems that Paul and I oftentimes find ourselves on the same current. You know, we have these wavelengths that we find one another in this world on, and it is always exciting and inspiring when you realize that you're on a current with someone else and you're learning something together about the cosmos that's completely beyond your sense of design or your sense of understanding. And this has recently happened between Paul Weston, my husband Andre, who is also here, and myself. So just let me reiterate, Andre and I teach a spiritual alchemy class called Spiritualized. And when we were thinking about how we were going to deal with this very difficult year, 2020, we thought that it was a really inspired idea to actually teach our spiritual alchemy class once again. Why? Because it allows you to transform the energies of the moment, to work with them, to flow with them, to be an active participant even during very dark times. Rather than stagnating, we actually want to initiate growth. We want to initiate evolution. And so in order to promote the launch of this class, our spiritual alchemy class, we started writing a series of emails, and the emails themselves were meant to be really entertaining articles. They were meant to be essays of a kind and to get people excited about opening up to a bigger vision of things, opening up to the magical state of consciousness. And one of those emails was all about Carl Jung and the Beatles.
And the Beatles.
So why don't you explain a little bit?
Oh, okay. Let me. So I forget the year it was that Carl Jung had this dream, but it was early in his career. Let me back up. The Carl Jung is the grandfather of synchronicity, the father of this concept of synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence where, it's like two multiverses like collide at the same time, and there is a confluence of happenstance and serendipity and coincidence that is you can't just write it off as meaningless and random any longer. It's when I think the best way to define synchronicity is when randomness becomes significant. And the famous story of Jung's discovery of the principle of synchronicity is that when he was treating a woman in his therapy practice who was really just anhedonin dysphoric, like not really feeling, just listless, not really feeling anything about life. And she had been she'd had a dream that she was describing to Jung, because he was, a psychoanalyst, a student of Freud, so dreams were a part of his therapy. And she describes receiving a scarab beetle as a gift. And at that moment, when she was describing this dream, a beetle flies into the office window.
In real life.
In real life. And and in that moment, he was able to provide her with an insight into her dream, which actually apparently turned the woman around, and she was able to find like a new lease on life and discover joy again. So the scarab beetle, the beetle itself, is very important in the mythology of Carl Jung.
It was not a coincidence.
It was not a coincidence.
It was a synchronicity.
It was a synchronicity. So that also ties into much earlier in his life, when he was, I believe it was during World War II, when all of these, when Europe was just drowning in blood. Jung had a dream in which him and a number of his friends were visiting Liverpool. And in this dream, he discovers it's like he has this vision of like the tree of life, or this fountain of everlasting life. It's at the end of this alley, in a square. And years later, a local poet in Liverpool had actually like mapped out Jung's dream and determined that what Jung was describing in his dream was actually a perfect description of this alley that leads to the square that is right outside the club where the Beatles had their first show. And then, years later, Jung is on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So, synchronicity. So yeah.
So we shared this story in one of our emails because Andre and I love to talk about these kinds of things, and we put together an email. And as soon as we did, we heard from you, Paul. You wrote right away, and you were really excited.
We got that the 7th of May, and the story immediately set me off because I had a whole load of other associations with it that I thought, I've got to check in with you to see that you know this stuff, because if you don't, it's going to blow your mind. And it turned out that, in fact, you did know this very well indeed, because the whole story of the KLF, John Higgs' book, etc., was something that Andre was reading, that you already knew this stuff. And you were really big on it. So, this is a great story for you to tell now.
Oh my God, the KLF. Well, let me just begin by, before we talk about what a strange duo is.
Yeah.
I have to say that during the quarantine, I had one of the most wonderful nights of my life. And it was because we were listening to the KLF all night on vinyl, because we have a friend who is a DJ.
Old school
has
LA
been a
DJ.
DJ since the 80s and actually has KLF on vinyl. So we had a really, really good night.
Yeah.
But that aside, Andre, you picked up that book.
I picked up that book. The artist Tommy Kelly, who I'd actually love to have on the show sometime, he was recommending it on his YouTube channel right when the quarantine began. And that, when that week, I guess it was like mid-March, just everything felt really weird. It just felt like we were at like a perpetual funeral or something. Like, it's like, dad's dead and we have to accept it, but we still have a shitload of work to do in the probate courts.
Yeah.
That's kind of just how it felt like collectively. I was looking for meaning, and this artist Tommy Kelly on his YouTube channel was talking about these old favorites of mine that I hadn't really hadn't visited since my undergrad years, over 10 years ago now, which was like the Invisibles, Discordianism, the Principia Discordia, and the KLF.
Yeah.
Who were this great acid house duo in the late 80s, early 90s. They actually only recorded 3 songs, but from those 3 songs, they did remixes and remasters, and they were able to produce these #1 like stadium anthem hits from being from these underground rave tracks, but they were very interesting. They had met actually 10 years prior to them forming the KLF on Ken Campbell's production of the Illuminatis, which was in the same structure that was at the end of the square where Jung had his dream. And the Illuminatis trilogy is Robert Anton Wilson's and Robert Shea's epic of the Illuminati versus the Discordians and the Justified Agents of Mu, or like this radical terrorist group that formed in the days of Atlantis, that have carried the message of Discordia. And it's a really beautiful novel. I actually haven't read it in over 10 years since I was an undergrad, so it's not that fresh in my memory. But either way, the KLF were this amazing uh, chaos magic acid house music duo that incorporated all of this mythology, all of the mythology that surrounds Discordianism. And the mythology that surrounds Discordianism is like, it starts actually in Jim Garrison's office, who was the New Orleans DA that investigated the Kennedy assassination. And so it's almost like this. It's like this unintended shadow of the Kennedy assassination was created this whole current of Discordianism. And for one example is like the KLF's record "Chill Out." It's this beautiful ambient house concept record that's based on a drive between Dallas, Texas, and New Orleans, along the Gulf Coast of the United States. And that drive in itself is what the drive that connects the site of the Kennedy assassination and Jim Garrison's office in New Orleans, where the Principia Discordia was originally produced on his Xerox machine by one of the author's girlfriends, who was an intern there at the time, and which is great too, because that is just presages all of the millennials who are running off, pirated PDFs of Libernal and Psychonaut in their office jobs.
Can you explain what the Principia Discordia is for people that have
The
never heard of
Principia
it?
Discordia is the satirical religious tract for that praises the goddess Eris, the goddess of chaos and discord.
And how do most people know this?
Most people know this from the Trojan War.
No, not Eris.
Eris.
The Principia Discordia.
Oh, most people know this from Robert Anton Wilson.
That's right.
Yes.
Robert
Okay.
Anton
I'm sorry. Yeah. Most people know this through Robert Anton Wilson, who incorporated it into as a main thread into the Illuminatus trilogy.
Yeah.
So I guess one thing leads to another. Yada yada yada. The KLF they understood myth and ritual and how to incorporate that without being pretentious and without it being like overdone. It was just almost like they had this very Taoist perspective. It's like they were just these channels, these very clear channels, and they would let this satire religion and this religious satire flow through them, and it eventually resulted in them burning £1 million that they had made solely on royalties since the day they retired.
Oh my God.
The day they broke up.
I love that story so much.
Yeah.
See, that was in a time when there was still some question about the ethics of selling out and letting money enslave you. That's when people still stood up against the slavery of money. And I haven't seen that in a while, but I really appreciate the KLF, and I appreciate the fact that they burned £1 million so much. Because
I think what's the really important point in John Higgs' book about that
yeah,
is that they literally don't really consciously understand why they did it.
yes,
They can present you with various, apparently coherent reasons,
yeah,
and they know that there is some deeper dynamic that they are participating in a mysterious story,
yeah,
the narrative of which they're not entirely responsible for, or at least their third dimensional egoic bodies are. There is some bigger story that they are involved in.
that's right.
That transcends their normal, biography, and that this is something that runs all the way through. And it's like once you play certain games with reality, you intensify the likelihood of this kind of thing kicking off. I think in that book, one of the things I really love, you see Bill Drummond, the main guy in the KLF, he had started off as a manager of some fledgling rock bands. He had been a manager of Echo and the Bunnymen, and he'd been a manager of Teardrop Explodes. And one of my favourite bits in that book is when he deliberately sets this thing in motion, that he will stand on the manhole cover in the middle of the square of Jung's dream, and near where Illuminatus was performed and so on. And he will arrange it that Echo and the Bunnymen are performing somewhere in Iceland at the time. He tried to get Teardrop Explodes to perform in Papua New Guinea. He didn't quite pull that off, but somehow through some mysterious interconnectedness, through ley lines and cosmic consciousness and all these things happening at the same time, something would be set off. And when you do something on that scale, you lose all kind of grip on any potential results. It will just gallop away. And that's probably part of what ultimately, you know, in the dreamlike narrative leads to the burning of £1 million so many years later.
Yeah, I think I read, not only do they not know why they did that, but I forget which one said this, but one of them has a child that came home from school and said, like, "Daddy, I heard you burned 100,000 quid." And he was like, I wish it was only 100,000. It was much worse than that. And I thought that was one of the funniest stories I've ever heard. On top of it all, the rumors that people spread about this lowball it so much because it's so beyond what an average human can even conceive of, that like even schoolyard gossip is like 900,000 short of what they actually did. And he doesn't know why, and I think that's brilliant. I think that's the kind of, that's actually like the true state of the magician. And I cannot quote this beautiful book right now, but I've been reading Meditations on the Tarot, which is actually written by an anonymous author, so I can't give you the author's name. It's one of the best books I've ever read in a lot of ways, and the whole meditation on the magician card is all about that perfect state of like playful presence, total innocence. There really is focus, but there's no burden as to like the expectation of the result. You're not burdened by that. You're just like the tightrope walker that is walking the tightrope. You're not overly concerned. You're very focused, but you're not concerned about what this means, why, and what the outcome is. You're just walking the tightrope.
And that work is a bit more precarious depending on what epoch of time you manifest in. You know, I think of Principia Discordia coming out of the Kennedy assassination matrix, and ultimately roping in people as diverse as Robert Anton Wilson, William Burroughs, and Timothy Leary, and the tremendous karma that brings about. And now it seems as if, you know, that period of time when they were burning that money, the early 90s, John Higgs calls it a strange liminal time. It certainly was for me. And it's now coming back on us in an epoch that, you know, has all these resonances with strange times gone by, the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, actually, Andre was just, speaking of the 60s really quick, Andre was just reading.
Oh, yeah, I did some bibliomancy with your
yeah. To have one of those right here,
Right.
Awesome.
Right. Yeah. Just
he randomly pulled.
Yeah, I randomly opened to the chapter on sympathy for the devil, on the connection between Anton LaVey, the Solar Lodge, Charles, and the Manson murders.
Yeah, I don't think.
A careful little place to land on at this time of the year when.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've got the Lionsgate coming up. So.
To be honest, I actually, FYI, I grew up on the east end of Simi Valley, which is where the Manson Ranch was. Spawn Ranch is in
my word,
my hometown. And I never did this because I have always had a certain sense of like morality and I'm self-preservation, but it was a thing when I was growing up for kids to go and take acid and go to Spawn Ranch and like crawl around the caves and stuff like that. I never did that, but I do know that people did that kind of thing.
There's an alarming amount of suicides.
Because there was a legendary dark place to go explore in my town, and it was, you know, the Manson caves. Yes, that's where I grew up.
Well, last year with the 50th anniversaries, I will say that Charlie intruded significantly for me. You know, he definitely did. I've steered reasonably clear of it this year, but it's always there. It's one of those things that's quite big in the back of my head. You know, if ever there was a Discordian trickster figure, you know, maxing it out in a way that shows just how potentially dangerous all that ultimately can be, depending on the context, then he is that person.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And you, in your book, you point out that what coincided with those horrible murders was this curse upon the whole hippie generation. Anton LaVey.
Yeah, Anton LaVey.
Cursed the hippies. Now, I don't think that I don't think I actually knew that before I read that in your book. You know, I don't think that I fully correlated the two things. I believe I'd heard that Anton LaVey disliked the hippies and had cursed them. But in terms of how it lined up in time, I had no idea that there was a connection. So that is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it even ties in because like there was the Rosemary. He played the devil in Rosemary's Baby, and then John Lennon's assassinated outside of the Dakota where they shot. Where yeah, it goes back to the Beatles. The Beatles actually, I mean, they really were like this MK Ultra like meta ritual that I don't even think their handlers or they knew quite the scope of it that they were getting involved at. I'm speaking tongue in cheek, of course.
Oh my God! But yeah, that whole samskara that was left that year.
Yeah.
I grew up in, so it's interesting that we're talking about that now.
Right, that is very interesting because all of that kind of bleeds through to the 1973-74 period, where, as a result of the fatigue and the ennui of the death of the 60s ideal, you've got a very, 73 was a very flipping weird year. You know, we had Comic Kahootek, we had Watergate, and this is the period of time that leads into, Cosmic Trigger, Robert Anton Wilson, Sirius, Philip K. Dick, John C. Lilly, the kind of stuff that Eric Davis has recently written about also well in High Weirdness. Yeah. All of that stuff, which does seem to be, for me, more vivid and more alive this year than I can remember it being for a long time.
Absolutely. Let's, can we go into that?
Yeah, we were just writing about John C. Lilly, actually, for our Mercury class.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, let's hope, because that's what we're here for, is to talk about the cosmic trigger days.
Sure.
Yeah,
I mean.
Okay, so we've got to we've expanded Higgs and so forth as a result of knowing that like you guys were down with that and that you were having into it at that very point in time. I'd sent my book History and Myth was at the printers, so I was in this kind of liminal zone where it's just, well, what do I get into? I'm going to read Johnny's book again. You know, so I started reading it straight away, and I finished it on the next weekend. So this is like by the 10th of May, Sunday the 10th of May, I finished it. And then on Monday, the 11th of May, this is when my book arrives, and it's arrived by like 9:30 in the morning. And it's like, I've got boxes of it up 2 flights of stairs, and I'm just completely blasted. And like, wow, here's my book. And I just sit back and it's like, well, now what? I'm all over the show. Wow, I've got the book. But then I look on my Facebook and there's a page for the play of Cosmic Trigger that Daisy Harris Campbell got together. And I see that there's a guy called Jamie Dodds who's got a podcast called F23 Podcast. And he's literally just dropped an interview with Daisy Harris Campbell about an immense, epic adventure that they had the previous year, last year, that was fully framed by Jung and the Liverpool Dream and everything. And so I settled down. It was quite a long thing. I knew a little bit about it when it happened, But because of the timing of everything, because I had just read John Higgs' book, because I'd been set off in such a way, and because of the weird circumstance of my book, which has got quite a lot, by the way, about the Lord and Misrule in it, I just settled in and I listened to this story. I listened to Daisy tell the story of how basically she had arranged, and this is quite some task, to get a coach party of 70 people to go from Liverpool, starting from the point where Jung's dream was located, to the point in Switzerland where he actually had that dream in his garden at Bollingen on the shores of the lake. And as part of this journey, they did a stop off, and this was at John Higgs' behest, at the Kern Abbas Giant, which is an ithyphallic chalk figure, you know, in the West Country of Britain. And they also went to the Large Hadron Collider, which is absolutely extraordinary, you know, and did some weird ceremony out there. And the general idea of it was that they're taking, you know, some kind of cosmic sperm from the phallus of the Kern Abbas Giant, from the large hard-on to the Large Hadron, and they're kind of fertilizing the great void of the particle accelerator, which to me is like the body of Newit, with a completely unknown kind of outcome. Just, you know, we're doing this, we don't really know why we're doing it, it's just all kind of hung together. It's got all this kind of inspiration behind it. I knew this stuff while it was going on last year, but I hadn't paid that much attention to it. But what immediately intrigued me was that the reason this story was being told now was that there had been a follow-through this year, and it had happened on April the 23rd, which was the first day in the narrative of Illuminatus. Now, what got my attention here was April the 23rd was the day that my book went to the printers. So I thought, hang on, what's happening here? There had been an episode up in the Welsh mountains where some people had actually gone there, some people had tuned in from a distance, and it was like the magical child that had been conceived then was somehow going to come to birth. And I think that in the end, the conception of what had happened there, it was almost like the Bard Taliesin out of the Celtic stories with the goddess Cerebrine and so on. There was a little bit of that going on there. But what really struck me when I listened to Daisy tell the story, I knew that Jung himself had visited Kern Abbas. And the way they told the story, I thought, I'm not sure they know this. You know, they're playing out this enormous great Jungian saga. They're actually, one of the big parts on their journey from beginning to end is actually somewhere where he's been. So John Higgs, Facebook friend, exchanged a few messages with him once or twice, nothing much, but I thought I'll get in touch with him. I'll say, look, did you know that you had been there? And in fact, no, they didn't know. And this kind of set off, you know, some considerable ramifications there. And as part of their duel, you know, right at the end when they got back to this country, there's a little bit of time spent in the area of Avebury and Silbury Hill, and Jung had been there as well. So this was kind of pretty strange. And I realised that like something was in motion. Now, the way this played out, I did end up having a conversation with Daisy on Skype. Now, I'm not going to say too much about all of that, but first of all, it's probably worth saying, for the sake of the audience who may not know this, who Daisy Ellis Campbell is. She is the daughter of Ken Campbell, who put on the play Illuminatus, which was a remarkable experimental thing, because the whole performance was about 18 hours long, I think. I'm not even sure how on earth anybody sat through it. And her mother was actually performing as Eris, the goddess of chaos, etc., in that very play. And she was conceived backstage during the course of the production. So she has got this Irisian vibe, you know, literally right there in her very DNA. And it's, you know, the Illuminatus play, I was talking about it as the Illuminatus working. It was a magical working. And now she's, you know, high priestess of extraordinary capers. And I told her basically why the Jung thing seems so significant to me, because me even knowing about this comes about as a result of one of the most powerful events in the whole of my life. I have written about it in a couple of my books, in Glastonbury Psychogeography. But how I learned that Jung had come to Glastonbury was not a standard thing where I just happened to find it in a book or I happened to see it on the internet. It came to me in a manner that was absolutely astounding. So I'll tell that story because the sheer power and intensity of that is really, I think, at the root of what's going on for me and how this is all rippling out.
Okay.
Glastonbury Abbey, okay, there was an abbot in the early Middle Ages called Sefrid Paloshin, and he was abbot for just 5 years between 1120 and 1125. He went on to somewhere else, Chichester. Now, his body was disinterred in the 60s. There's some controversy over whether it was him or it wasn't. Some people say it wasn't. But his body was found to be wearing an Abraxas ring. Now, this was quite a kind of common thing. It dates from the early, Alexandrian Hermetic, early centuries AD. The Abraxas gems, they're widespread. They've got the Gnostic god Abraxas on them. They might have Yahweh on, they might have Horus on, they might have different things in Hebrew or in Latin, Gnostic names of God, whatever. But the intriguing thing is that 1,000 years later, there are churchmen that have got these. Thomas Aquinas had one. One of the popes had one. Mm-hmm. And what was really strange about it was, for me, just this sense of heresy. I love this little waft of heresy that maybe somebody that was abbot at Glastonbury Abbey. That was just part of my mental furniture. Now, at the end of 2002, my friend the mysteries writer Andrew Collins often used to come down to Glastonbury at New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, and we'd get up to some sort of odd thing, go out in the landscape, do a visualization and meditation. And he just secured some interesting items that had been made by a guy called Graham Fenn Edwards, who was like an early sort of chaos magician type figure who'd once lived in Whitby in the house that Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in. And he made a foot-tall figurine of Abraxas. And it was like pretty full-on, ithyphallic, rooster head. And Andy said, I'm going to bring this down. What should we do with it? What can we do with it? And I immediately thought of this Glastonbury Abbey thing, and I thought, why don't we go in Glastonbury Abbey on New Year's Day, stick it on the altar in the Mary Chapel downstairs in the crypt, and I will recite some of Jung's words of the 7 Sermons of the Dead, which is a work that he kind of, maybe we can say he mediumistically channeled it in one of the strangest episodes of his life in 1916. And it's a bit like Crowley's Book of the Law. If you've got my book there, I'll do a whole comparison of Jung's 7 Sermons and the Book of the Law. For 3 days, Jung just comes out with this stuff that he says is through Basilides, who is one of the early Gnostic teachers. And it's all about Abraxas as this terrifying embodier of opposites. And I've first got into it in the 90s. I thought, wow, won't that be a powerful thing to do? And a very full-on thing to do, because it's like it's a sanctified church. There's people milling about, and here we are, we're sticking this statue, a rooster-headed dude with a stiffy, and I'm reciting these strange words to Abraxas. It could be considered quite blasphemous, but I always thought of it as just heretical. Mm-hmm. So we did it. We did it, and, a very brief extract to give a sense of how powerful Jung's words are. Abraxas is undefinable life itself, which is the mother of good and evil alike. He's the brightest light of day and the deepest night of madness. He is both the radiance and the dark shadow of man. Abraxas generates truth and falsehood, good and evil, light and darkness with the same word and in the same deed. Therefore, Abraxas is truly the terrible one. He is the monster of the underworld, the octopus with 1,000 tentacles. He is the twistings of winged serpents of madness. To fear him is wisdom. Not to resist him means liberation. And they're the exact words that I've taken from the multiple 7 sermons and put together that I recited in Glastonbury Abbey on New Year's Day 2003. And that was a thing in itself. You know, we could quite easily have been interrupted by some little old lady. You know, it's New Year's Day, it's Glastonbury Abbey, there's loads of people about. I felt that if we were really doing something wrong, it would be so easy to have just, something would have happened to stop us.
Yeah.
Now, at that point, I was working as manager of a Mind, Body, Spirit warehouse. The Speaking Tree bookshop in Glastonbury is actually part of a wholesale business. I was in a warehouse with like 500,000 books, so there's a lot of room for synchronicity when there's 500,000 books. A couple of weeks later, a book comes in about Jung, and I have no idea why I looked up Glastonbury in the index. I did not have any conscious reason to expect there to be anything there, but there was, and it's that he had come to Glastonbury. Now, when I tried to track down the details further, it seems that this particular book had got it wrong. But I later found an anthology of writings by a guy called Daniel C. Noel called In a Wayward Mood. And he had actually interviewed the wife of a Jungian therapist called Heston Baines, who was sometimes called Peter Baines. And she had told all about the occasion where he, Heston Baines, his wife, and Jung and Emma Jung had gone on an excursion to the West Country in 1939. They'd gone to the Kern Abbas, they'd gone to Avebury Silbury, they'd come to Glastonbury, and we knew where they stayed, and it's a place, you know, it's now a block of flats, but it was an inn then. And we know that Jung was on Cadbury Castle, which is an old hill fort associated with King Arthur. He was there on Easter Sunday, so the Easter Sunday sunrise in 1939, and it brought to mind his time with the Zuni Indians, apparently affected him very deeply. But his wife, Emma, as you may well know, was quite big on the Grail. He kind of didn't write as much about that as he might have done because he was letting her get on with it. Now, where they stayed is literally just over the road from Glastonbury Abbey. There is no way they did not go in Glastonbury Abbey, and they did not go down into the Mary Chapel. They did not essentially stand probably a matter of feet away from where I had recited those very words. Now, Jung actually came into possession in the mid-20s of one of these Abraxas gems. Didn't necessarily have Abraxas on it, but he had it reshaped in order to fit him. You'll see a lot of photos of him where he's got his hand up like that or something, and you can see this ring on him. And the period of time, he wore it all the time from that point on. So when he came down into the Abbey, he almost certainly would have been wearing this Abraxas gem. And what was even more crazy was that the Seven Sermons to the Dead was not really well known at all during his lifetime. It turns up, he talks about it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections right at the end of his life, but very few people knew about it. But there'd been an English translation in 1925 that had not said it was Jung. It simply said Basilides, and it had been published by the famous Watkins in London. And the guy that translated it was Heston Baines. So the very guy that has brought Jung to Glastonbury is the guy that has translated the words that I have recited in Glastonbury Abbey. So this was just gigantic. You know, it completely blew my brain to pieces. There were more. It was nestled like a little Russian egg in a lot of other things that were going on. There were some very dark, mysterious things that went on then, but in itself, in terms of my connectedness to Jung, to his work, to some kind of current in Glastonbury, and to that time that he came here. So what this did was, you know, there's a time release on it. It's like, this is 2003, it's 2020, that somehow or another we now realise that the visit to Kern Abbas is somehow tied in with some immeasurably vast epic involving the Cosmic Trigger crew, involving a journey from Liverpool and Jung's dream to Bollingen. You know, they actually, I didn't realise this, apparently, that you could even get in there, you know, that they were actually at Jung's tower in the garden on by the lake. I think they recited all sorts of stuff they did there. You know, it's a story for days to tell. But this now, it's clear there is what I'd call psychoactive voltage in this very, very mysterious pilgrimage of Jung to the West Country in that period of time, because it's off the radar of Jungian studies. it's not something you could look in some enormous biography of him and not find a word about it. And yet it has impacted on me in that way with the 7 Sermons in Glastonbury, and it's now impacting on the Cosmic Trigger crew with this whole thing at Kernabbas. And I simply say there's no way that's the end of it. You know, more will, something else. Now we've woken up to the fact that there is such a huge picture involved in this. There is unquestionably, you know, more to come. And there are lots of resonances. It's like John Higgs, as you probably know, wrote an excellent biography of Timothy Leary.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't realise, you know, that while I was writing my Crowley book, Higgs had been given some of Timothy Leary's ashes. A lot of people got different amounts of them. He actually went up on Glastonbury tour with Brian Barrett, who had the famous episode with Leary in the Algerian desert, where they stepped into Crowley's shoes. They scattered some of some of Leary's ashes on Glastonbury tour. I didn't even know about it. It wasn't publicised. If I'd have known about it, I'd have galloped up there while I was writing that Crowley book. You know, about a couple hundred metres down the road from the tour. You know, there are just endless resonances. And now, you know, I might have said this last time, I know it's a point I've made on a number of podcasts. It's like we're in a Robert Anton Wilson novel. All the rival reality tunnels are just, you know, they've fought themselves to a standstill, and what comes out of the void is just this dynamic trickster force that is somehow carrying all the voltage of these great figures, Jung, RAW, Crowley, the whole thing is fired up to the max. So that's, you know, that's what I've come into this conversation with. So I'm obviously fairly buzzed up with it.
Wow, thank you very much. What an amazing story. Thank you.
That's great. That's just amazing.
I feel very lucky and very...
You guys started this all off. You're the beginning of this narrative chain.
Completely.
If we could do it in linear time, who knows what the fourth dimensional aspect of it is, but you've set this in motion. You're a part of this story.
I'm so excited.
This is why you need to read things, and you need to share things.
Yes.
You need to learn things, and you need to share what you learn.
Yes.
With the people that you love. And
well, you know, I have to say, like, we have a real teacher in our life, and so much always weaves back into the fact that we have a real teacher and a real place of learning. And certainly, like, I had been exposed to Carl Jung and alchemy and things like that outside of this place, but when you have a real place of learning and transmission, it weaves you into the story in a way that sort of like trying to force it into your reality just never ever does. And I'm really grateful because the man that married us is also our teacher, is Andre's martial arts teacher, my tutor.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he's a Taoist priest, and he's a master of many different martial arts. I can't even name them all, actually, because I actually don't even know. I think it's like 6 or 7 different martial arts.
About that, yeah.
So I presume, Andre, you're pretty big on Jung's stuff, on Secret the Golden Flower and his Taoist Rainmaker stories, and all those kind of things.
Yeah, that's...
He's also...
Yeah. I actually been... That's... I put that at the... that's been sneaking its way to the top of my quarantine reading list, because I read that back when I initially got into the Taoist internal arts, and a lot of it went over my head because it's just, you know, there's I've been working with this idea that, you know, there's information, there's knowledge, there's wisdom, and those 3 things will synthesize into understanding. And like understanding is that final intuitive step you take where, you know, with information is, you know, you meet a girl at a bar. Knowledge is she goes home with you. Wisdom is you guys get married. But the understanding is, you know, when you say to somebody, you know, my wife, and they say to you, you know, oh, you're married, and I'm married too, and there's an understanding between the two of you of what marriage actually is, what the experience of marriage actually is, you know. So when I initially read this text, it was very much in that information stage of my practice in Taoist internal arts. So I would very much like to revisit it. Thank you for mentioning that.
Do you know Jean Shinoda Boland's work?
No.
I'm sorry?
Jean Shinoda Boland. She's a Jungian analyst. She wrote a book called The Taoist Psychology, Synchronicity in the Self, way back, decades back. Short book, wonderful, absolutely wonderful, hot, heavily recommended.
Okay.
You know, you could read it in an afternoon.
Great.
She's great. You know, it all hangs together very well with her. But yeah, that Taoist rainmaker story, I've always loved that. You know, there's problems with the rain. They get this guy and he just sets himself up in a hut. Don't disturb me. You know, you're out. Everyone's out of sync with the Tao here. I've just got to sit here, and it will just do itself. And people looking through the windows, it's like, what weird esoteric stuff is this guy doing? He's not doing anything. He's just making himself a cup of tea and having some food or whatever. And then a couple of days later, it starts pouring down with rain. Job done. And I love that. You know, that to me, this mysterious thing, the synchronistic process, when you've simply got your practice right, and the practice might be pretty diverse, it just does itself. And there is a timing on it. And clearly we're all involved in some bigger weird thing that's going on during this strange drama of the world. But it has been, we haven't had to strain to get this to happen, this remarkable unfolding of what we're talking about now. It's literally just kind of done itself. We just had the necessary knowledge to be talking about it and to communicate it to people when it became relevant. Real simple stuff. Yeah. And yeah, it's epic, you know, and it's just so full of multi-dimensional fun and games. And yet at its heart is a real simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
I really want to come. I want to visit Glastonbury a lot for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, when we're allowed to leave the country.
It's added another story to that, like, desire to come to Glastonbury someday. But yeah, when we're allowed to leave the country again.
Yeah, it's a little bit strange at the moment. And yet the levels of communication, I've had more extraordinary communication across the globe, meaningful communication with people when I've just been totally isolated in my living room with my laptop than I maybe had for years with going out, doing lectures, doing all kinds of stuff. Yeah. So that's at least an encouragement for this, whatever the new dispensation is becoming, and that we've got some profound free willingness as to what we create with it.
Yes,
very true.
There are good options in this situation.
Yes, yeah. I felt that too. The intensification of the quality of communication online. You know, because necessity seems to have like constricted things in such a way. I mean, that's the Saturnian force anyway, is like providing a lot of restriction, but that also focuses energy. And so there is, I think, a more laser beam of communication that's happening between people. It's not as decadent. It's much more concentrated and therefore higher quality. And I'm really starting to understand more and more and appreciate more and more the level of like embodiment and presence that's there when you're communicating is how well you're communicating. It's not the words that you're using. It's how much energy you're truly emitting. And I feel like that for the first time is really viscerally understood by me. I think it was something I intellectually entertained, but that's, again, it's what you were describing. It was just the information level.
Well, I think once I will know about all this, and from the sense of Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon, you know, it's like the force is just present with these people. And I'm sure that like with somebody like Jung, you literally only had to just be sitting in a room with him or Crowley or RAW, and there's this osmosis, you know, that just occurs. And in fact, you know, one of the things I'm writing about now, Colin Wilson met Robert Graves, you know, and a big realization for me was that something very mysterious passed between them. The Colin Wilson, I don't think ever even realized what it was, but because I recognized what they call Shaktipat, you know, or the transmission of energy that with people that are real bards, shaman, poets, you know, people like Graves, that he was packing this kind of voltage, and he did this. He did this to other people. He did it to David Allen of Gong, which I write about in my Avalonian Eon, and I realised he did it to Colin Wilson. The whole of Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, is permeated by the Robert Graves transmission. You know, and it is that thing about the embodiment. There are things that, in a way, don't even have to be said, but you actually pick it up, and you will end up, you know, saying the words and having the terminology alive in your own head. This thing is understood very well in the Eastern traditions. It's not understood quite, you know, maybe it was understood by some of the real full-on Kabbalists and so on at one point. But you know, the great thing about having all of this knowledge and understanding from the East and the Eastern transmissions is that we can apply it. You know, we can experience it with all the stuff that we're getting from our Western heritage as well, bringing it to life, literally. When I write about this in Attic Artist, it was when I had a Reiki initiation and when I took Osho Sannyas as an energy initiation. What came out of that void was just a massive Western mystery tradition past life extravaganza. You know, I'd gone into this sort of Advaita Vedanta zone in the East, and yet out of that void just came absolutely miraculous stuff relating to, you know, this geographical landscape. It is a unity, you know, and like we are, especially, you know, you guys in the West Coast, it's been that way for a long time. But, you know, the days of Isalin and so forth, the East-West synthesis, it's a very dynamic thing. Very dynamic thing.
Yeah, I mean, where we live, things that are 100 years old are actually old, you know, so new here. But one of the old things in our community is the Vedanta Society, you know, in the Edwardian era in the 1920s, like, you know, the Vedanta Society built a beautiful ashram up in the foothills of...
That's where Darfrey John went and had his experience back in 1970 that set him off, if I remember rightly. Listening. You know that one?
No.
You know about Artie Dar? Well, he started off as Franklin Jones, went to Muktananda, Nityananda, had all kinds of tremendous transmission experiences, and then sat on his own in the Vedanta temple, and, you know, everything just ground to a halt, and there he was from that point on.
Wow.
But that's quite a good story from that locale about how that is still packing some energy, still doing the stuff.
Yeah, well, it's one of my favorite places. We go there all the time, specifically because they have a family of deer, and there's always like baby deer to go sit next to and meditate. So it's quite seriously one of my favorite places, and it's full of that kind of
the Audi Dog connection. That's really interesting.
Yeah, we need to.
Yeah.
God, yeah. So we also have we have Yogananda like woven in here as well. He was
I mean the whole California. We've got the LA is just. I mean, there's so much contained here, and it's such a despondent. You know, the film noir aspect of LA is just, it will forever be alive with these developers that are in all these shady land grabs and turning the whole landscape into this one massive, you know, luxury condominium complex. But within all of this, like, corruption and oppression, we have the Yogananda, the Mother Center, the SRF Mother Center. We have, you know, Manly P. Hall's.
Within a 10-mile radius.
Yeah.
We have the Vedanta Society. We have the Mother Center of the Self-Realization Fellowship, Yogananda. We have
the Philosophical Research Society. And the builders of the Adaitam.
We also have the ravine where Jack Parsons was exploding his rockets and doing those hymns.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
That ravine is now the site of JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, but it used to be just kind of the extended experimental property of Caltech, which is in Pasadena. So it's kind of the outskirts of Pasadena that bumps right up into our neighborhood, and we can go hiking there to this day. So that's, also where the OTO was back in the Edwardian era, the 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, Pasadena,
Pasadena,
Orange Grove
Boulevard.
Rose Parade. Yeah.
So that's where the OTO Lodge was, and that's also where Scientology was founded, and we have plenty of them around too.
The East-West current. It's
really insane.
Los Angeles really is like this nodal meeting point.
We have it all here. It was the information age.
Yeah. But enough of LA boosterism. We should start writing
talk about energy and the Scientology conception of theta. I'll tell you an interesting little vignette I'll chuck in from shortly after I finish the Crowley book.
Okay.
I've got this thing that wherever Ron Hubbard was, they turn it into a kind of theme park museum. And they sort of rebuy all the old furniture and redo it exactly as it was when he was there. And it's like he's still there. It's Ron's office all around the world. And there was a place in London that he'd been in the 1950s where they had run the processes for the book Have You Lived Before This Life, which is a pretty strange one with past lives in outer space and so on. And they'd done this place up exactly as it was when he was there, and they had an office that had the desk that he used to have and his old typewriter. And you can visit them. And I went in there and I sat down at his desk and put my fingers on the key of his typewriter. Now, what I noticed when I was in there was I was getting higher and higher and higher and higher. I was in a real altered state of consciousness. And they do say that when you go into these places and they've run all these processes and people have been releasing all this stuff and experiencing whatever, that it's kind of theta energy and it stays there with you. Now, I went from there into a restaurant and I went down into a restroom and I looked at myself in the mirror and my pupils were as dilated as if I'd done acid. Wow. That was a physiological thing that stayed with me for, the best part of an hour afterwards. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating, that whatever the hell you can say against it, that's because I'm very sensitive to these things and the transmission of these dudes. I saw the Indian Holy Woman, Mother Meera, once, and when I was sitting in the queue waiting to get up to her and she looks into your eyes, my feelings started vibrating. Which is like a real tangible physical thing. You can't argue with something as physical as that. And it's all on a spectrum. And you've got a lot of it situated all around you. So you definitely don't need to go out to Sparm Ranch and do some acid and crawl about in the caves when we've got all of that.
Yeah.
You'll get as diverse a hit of the divine as you need without going, Charlie did identify himself with Abraxas, by the way. There are a few occasions where he actually said, I am Abraxas, just to sort of chuck that cheerful note in.
Yeah, so his it was last-ditch effort to the parole board to declare
right?
himself Abraxas.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
I actually did not know.
Yeah, and it's right. I mean, it's in here. It's one of his parole hearings. He declared himself Abraxas. Yeah. It's I think it was against the advice of his legal counsel though. But
I'm just going to turn my light on because it's getting a bit dark here.
Okay.
Okay.
Oof.
It's like the sun has risen. My
Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah.
I forget that it's
a Lammas light around me now. Yeah.
Right. That's good. Yeah. It's the middle of the hot afternoon here. So what time is it there? Like 9 o'clock?
It is. Yeah. It is literally almost exactly 9 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. I got it. I knew it. It's 8 hours.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. We're actually in your past. So we're speaking to you from the past. You're in the future.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of that, in terms of time scale, I find it very intriguing. The center of gravity of the thing is Robert Anton Wilson and Cosmic Trigger, which comes out of the period of time, mid-70s, the Illuminati's play. And yet we're going even further back with Jung. Now, I'm not saying there's no Crowley about. I've got a lot of Crowley going on, but when you read Cosmic Trigger and when you read Illuminatus, Crowley and Leary centrally important to the whole thing. Jung is definitely important, but he isn't centrally important. And yet in this whole saga, he has been so massively important. And, you know, I know with Daisy that Jung has been a big deal for her right from the word go. So what that means, because, you know, Jung seems to be a very different character temperamentally, that's for sure. I mean, he obviously was very different temperamentally to Crowley, but I've shown, I believe, in my book that there are some very mysterious commonalities with Book of the Law and Seven Sermons. It's all part of the Gnostic revival as a bigger thing. And the same can be said, you know, of when we move forward with people like Leary and RAW. And it's just that wisdom that completely goes beyond the usual opposites, you know, in what Abraxas is made to say by Jung. It's kind of quite scary, it definitely is, but it is so pertinent to what we've got going on now, because the opposites are just cancelling each other out. You know, that's where the challenge of the new gnosis is. Everybody is just so entrenched in the demonisation of the opposition that it's just groundswell, and that's left it all open for us.
Mm-hmm.
Left it all to do whatever the hell it is we're actually going to do. You know, what we're going to make of all this.
That's very true. I do feel a certain, I mean, we've had a lot of wonderful times this year.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been.
It's been very liberating in some ways.
Yeah, it's been a liberating year.
You know, and physically we have obviously been limited in what we can do, but we've been going to the local cemetery. We've been going to Forest Lawn, and this is it's a very old and historical place. Once again, in the context of Los Angeles, it's over 100 years old. So it's like, wow, it's got so much history, and we have made the best of that because it's like a true sanctuary. You know, we actually have a genuine sanctuary to go to, and we can walk and we can just be there with all this ancestral energy. And Yogananda is buried there, Elizabeth Taylor is buried there, all this beautiful art. Yeah. So we just go, and that's where we spent all of our time physically outside of our apartment. But it's been really wonderful.
Yeah, but like Paul's saying, like this year is just for the global.
The imagination is huge.
The amount you can travel just by staying in your living room.
Yes.
Has been epic.
I feel like I do not feel bound. I don't feel locked down.
I think the main thing is just the discrimination of like fading on the right influences.
Yeah.
You know, we've got going on is incredibly complicated. But in a good way, there's a downside to that with the people that are, you know, completely immersed themselves 24/7 in all this conspiracism. And it's just a cul-de-sac, it's just a hall of mirrors, and it's very, however much information, however incredibly expansive it seems, it isn't expansive, it's insular, it's claustrophobic, and it's closing people right down. Mm-hmm. Whereas you can just tell from the feel of it that what we've been talking about is the exact opposite of all that. Mm-hmm. It's endlessly expansive and liberating and inclusive, and it just, you know, it's healthy, it's sane. Even when we're talking about Spine Ranch and crawling about doing acid in the caves, it's compared to, you know, QAnon and mold children and adrenochrome and all the kind of stuff that I'm just getting stuffed on my Facebook feed every single day. It's qualitatively different.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like, to bring it back to the you mentioned Enter the Dragon earlier, and it's like the end of Enter the Dragon, where like he is trapped in this hall of mirrors, and the way through it is to actually shatter the mirror.
I love that.
Is to like actually shatter the illusion of reality that you're being like squared off against, you know. And that's exactly what you're saying. It's like this whole current of synchronicity that all kind of circles around Robert Anton Wilson. It is so liberatory. It is liberating of all the bullshit.
Interestingly, since we're bringing up Bruce Lee, he was our patron saint for Mars and Scorpio, which was the last transit of Mars that I can remember before all of this went down. Before this new thing hit, the pandemic or whatever you want to call it. And so we were working with Bruce Lee.
Yeah. Yeah,
right
well,
before this all hit.
I've got his dirt on my ancestral altar from his
Really?
grave.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, just one moment then, because I will now show you something.
Yay. Oh my God.
Let's see.
That's I've got that up.
Wait, can you hold that up again? Because
all my vitamin supplements and all the ridiculous amount of stuff that I shoveled down my neck, I've got that up on my wall as one of my inspirational kind of icons.
Awesome. Yeah, no, he was the original chaos magician in a lot of ways. That his theory of martial arts, that no form, only form, no style, only style, like the whole philosophy of Jeet Kune Do is revolutionary.
That's a good point.
Well, what I always say to people who talk about, energies and like it hasn't been proved, the idea of chi energy and prana and kundalini and so forth. I say, look, Bruce Lee proved it in 1964 when he demonstrated the 1-inch punch for the first time.
Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
It's as simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's no way of doing that with any normal configuration of training that, boxers or anybody like that, you have to have internal energy sorted out in order to do that. And that was just proven categorically to anybody that could just see it for what it was. And that remains the case.
Very true.
Yeah.
Became empirical.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had the pleasure of visiting Seattle, and so we knew that meant we were going
That was a crazy day too. I mean, that was one of those like synchronicity days when everything came together, because I go on my Facebook feed in the morning, and I know that Zuckerberg's listening, but we hadn't talked about our plans to go to Bruce Lee's grave that day. It doesn't matter, because apparently the day that we were planning to go to Bruce Lee's grave was the day that he wrote this letter to himself, dedicating his life to this path of becoming the biggest Chinese American martial art movie star, making a certain amount of money, and he actually achieved all of these things before he died when he was 32. So and it was just such a synchronicity that this letter that was written on that very day, it was the day that we were going to visit Bruce Lee's grave. So Rachel and I wrote our own version of this letter of what we are dedicating ourselves to, and we read it in front of Bruce Lee's grave and made an offering. And then
so Rachel, then you must have contemplated Bruce Lee's astrology and what a mystery it is that he was a man of such great destiny and a comet. What have you managed to figure out from that? Is there anything striking there?
Well, we were focusing. Actually, I haven't actually read his chart in a really intentional way. I know that we chose him as the patron saint of Mars and Scorpio because he was
a Mars and
Scorpio.
Right.
But actually, I do need to do a proper
No, I'd imagine that there are points in his biography where you would almost inevitably find really strong pointers.
Yeah,
that would be most instructional. So maybe there's a Bruce Lee post coming up sometime in the future.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I definitely.
The point where he really damaged his back, the points where he goes back and forth across the oceans to different parts of his career and the different breaks that he gets, and then obviously, when he finally dies, there's got to be some stuff that's fairly striking there.
You're right. I'm going to actually start looking into it. That's very curious.
Obviously, tying Brandon with that somewhere along the line as well, because that is obviously infinitely mysterious.
I think there's two things about his chart that interested me, which is that he is he's a Sagittarius rising, like we are.
Oh man, was his sun conjunct with the ascendant, just like Andy Warhol.
Yeah, you're right. We need to do a proper I'm going to do a proper analysis of Bruce Lee, looking at significant moments in his life, because the letter of dedication, that date, plus all the highlights of his career, we can actually map it out. It'll be really good. Good idea, Paul. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I mentioned Stalin earlier on in the whole East-West mix. He's one of the most tremendous examples of what that means in real terms.
Yeah.
I mean, everything about it, what he was brought up with, and then what he fed himself on intellectually when he got to America, and how that became dynamically alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's crazy, you know, I see people slagging off that ethos and slagging off asylum, but I'm thoroughly infused with that. Thoroughly. And the whole, you know, evolutionary psychology of Michael Murphy and so forth, and the investigation of extreme states in sports, you know, peak experiences in sports. I feel really fortunate I came to some of the literature on that decades ago, you know, and it has informed my general way of being immensely, you know, inner running, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, you're right there. You're right there in the fertile matrix where this stuff is just, it never stops.
Yeah.
It's true. Yeah, it's true. We are
I
learning
have to close the windows.
traditional Taoist internal alchemy from a 5,000-year-old lineage in North Hollywood. And that's because communist China didn't want these people anymore. They kicked them out. So they came here. And now
This is much they kicked them out, but it's that
they ran.
They were fleeing.
They ran for their
persecution.
lives. Yeah.
Dalai Lama left Tibet the day before I was born. So, you know, in terms of the bigger kind of karma of things, I think those guys coming to the West and being around in the background of the 60s, like Chogyam Trungpa being available to hang with Jose Arguelles and Allen Ginsberg and that in the Roper Institute where people like flipping William Burroughs and Ginsberg can give up, you know, it's so fertile. And there you've got a good example of whereas with Charlie, the crazy wisdom, you know, goes right off the rails. With Chogyam Trungpa, all right, he died of alcoholism. There was a whole car crash thing going on there, but he's left us with that.
Yeah.
You know, a whole bunch of lectures and stuff, audio that you can listen to, where there's people like Ginsberg and Burroughs talking about poetry and Dharma art, all this kind of stuff. This is the absolute, you know, the prime example of how all that stuff comes together in a fertile way.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed.
Yeah.
I love Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love Allen Ginsberg. He was maybe the first poet that I got really into outside of school.
Right.
Like I feel like he was never assigned. Nothing about him was known to me in school.
Is that coming through on the mic?
Oh, there's lawnmowers.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay.
It's just how it is, you know. There's sounds in the
Sorry.
background. It's okay. But yeah, Allen Ginsberg was the first poet that I ever fell in love with completely outside of the academic paradigm, and it was like so exciting. It was like taking acid for the first time. But I was, 12, and I was just reading poems. So yeah.
Well, I've dealt with him, as you probably know, to a certain extent in my Blake book, and I knew that he'd come here in 1966, but there was a photograph of him that dated, it looked like it was from the 1970s, where he's standing outside a pub in Glastonbury where they've got a no hippies sign. And I was trying to find out where it came from, and literally in the last couple of weeks, there's been a volume of reminiscences of Colin Wilson come out, and there's an old Allen Ginsberg piece that had not been published before, where it says how he actually met up with Colin Wilson in Glastonbury in 1978, and Colin Wilson gave him a tour of Glastonbury. And I can only say that I'm highly envious of that situation. I would like to have gone round Glastonbury with Colin Wilson and Allen Ginsberg in 1978.
That sounds really, that would be so cool.
That would have been dope.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, should we wrap it up soon?
I think so, because we're being invaded by lawnmowers.
Yeah.
Which I think must be.
Well, that sounds like a dystopian sci-fi situation.
Totally. No, I mean, that's apartment life. So we have no control of when the gardeners come. So
Yeah, do apologize for that.
Well, no, I think we've covered quite a bit of ground from the point of view of the extent. I'd like to think that we'll fry the brains of at least some of our listeners.
Absolutely, absolutely, and
well,
I think we should
change the thought will be set in motion.
Yeah, we should schedule another one of these maybe sometime around the equinox.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be a follow through from this, and it will have its own life, and a whole bunch of things that would be pertinent, may reveal themselves by then.
We can take some notes. follow some threads, and I'll definitely have some research on Bruce Lee done by then. We can
Okay.
talk about that.
All right.
And I would, actually, it's just occurred to me by way of a little addendum there. It's curious to me that the three main stars of Enter the Dragon all kind of die within about a month of each other, don't they? Because Jim Kelly was the end of June, and John Saxon's just gone, hasn't he? And Bruce Lee was July the 20th. So all those guys kind of seem to depart within a kind of month period. I mean, over a few years, obviously, but I did note that when John Saxon went the other week. It was quite soon after the anniversary of Bruce's death, and Jim Kelly had gone right at the end of June, I think.
Interesting. I never would have thought that.
Crazy.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really grateful that
Thank you, Paul.
you wanted to share all this with us.
Thank you guys. It's been great having a vibey conversation with people that know the score and are responsive to it, and we know that, you know, we're setting something off here.
Our pleasure.
Awesome.
Our role in this was we just opened the door.
Yeah.
And you waltzed in. And thank you so much for joining us with, you know, all of this amazing connection and all these stories to add to the stories that we were trying to tell. It's been like a delight.
Moral of the story, share what you love with the people that you love.
Absolutely, because things multiply ad infinitum, like beyond.
Well, I'll certainly be sharing the result of this around with some of the people that we've actually talked about in the course of the conversation, so it will just intensify.
For sure.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I hope you
Paul.
have a beautiful, beautiful day, and we will talk to you again someday.
All right.
Yes. Yay to you both.
I would like to thank Paul Weston one more time for coming on our show. It was really, really lovely to have him back. And if you would like to learn more about Paul Weston, or you would like to find out about his books, I recommend that you visit his website, paulwestonglastonbury.com. paulwestonglastonbury.com.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Stargazer. You can listen to this show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Aeolian Heart Astrology. And if you like today's show, support my Patreon so you can get secret episodes and early access to new shows.